Colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today to DCU during National Academic Integrity Week. I am particularly excited to welcome our esteemed guest, Professor Rajiv Jhangiani from Brock University in Ontario, Canada. We are greatly looking forward to his invited talk, which is entitled Designing for Integrity with Integrity. Professor Jhangiani serves as the Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning at Brock University, overseeing a portfolio of the Centre for Pedagogical Innovation, the Co-op Career and Experiential Education and Professional Continuing Studies. He leads the Inclusive Education Research Lab, which investigates open educational practices, inclusive teaching and ethical approaches to educational technologies. Rajiv is perhaps best known in the field for his long-standing work on open access pedagogies and open textbooks that help, as we know, to reduce the financial and other access barriers to all learners. The ethos of his work is characterized by a consistent endeavour to help those who need it most. DCU and Brock University have just signed a new campus-wide student exchange agreement, and that will open study abroad opportunities to students across both institutions, strengthening a partnership of nearly a decade between our respective business schools. And it paves the way also for a broader student mobility beyond business now. I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Mary Claire Kennedy from the University of Limerick and Chair of the National Academic Integrity Network, NAIN, who is one of our panel respondents today. Thank you, Mary Claire. And finally, a huge welcome to our 100 online attendees who are members and friends of the Irish Learning Technology Association, ILTA. I have presented myself at several of ILTA's annual EdTech conferences, and I'm published, in fact, in their open access paper. It hence gives me great pleasure to invite you all to EdTech 2026, which will be hosted here on the St. Pat's campus of DCU on the June 3rd and 4th, 2026. So looking forward to meeting many of you there. The topic of today's talk is particularly fitting, given the ongoing concerns about academic integrity and the conversations we are all having in our respective institutions about how we discuss these issues among ourselves and with our students. Hopefully today and this week will help us frame the debate to include equity and integrity in the design of our learning environments, such that we can make them fair, equitable and welcoming for learners and for educators alike. Thank you. Agus go raibh míle maith le léir.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I have to say, well done on pronouncing my name, which is not the easiest name I know to pronounce as well. So good morning, everyone. It's really a privilege to be back at DCU, especially now that, as I mentioned, we have an MOU between our institutions. So in addition to, of course, student exchanges, one of the things I hope to see much more of is faculty mobility. We're pleased to host visiting scholars from DCU at Brock as well in the future. I do want to thank Dr. Eamon Costello. Of course, it's such a treat to work with and a leader in the field, quite frankly. So I also want to thank my co-panelists for what I'm sure will be insightful perspectives and invigorating discussion. And of course, all of you for attending, whether in person or online. Looking at feedback. That's why you get to say hello to the online people. And finally, I want to thank, this works. Yes, there we go. I do want to thank the ILTA, I want to thank NAIN, and of course DCU for hosting this event at the start of National Academic Integrity Week. Before I begin, as is customary where I come from, I want to acknowledge that Brock University is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work across the Niagara region today. This land where Brock is located is situated on territory that's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And I'd like to show this picture up here. What you're seeing is two treaty belts. The one at the top is known as the Dish with One Spoon, It's an ancient indigenous law and wampum treaty between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee that really speaks to the importance of sharing resources and territory responsibly. And the second one, the two-row belt, is a historic treaty belt as well between the Haudenosaunee and European settlers. And that symbolizes a commitment to peace and mutual respect between two distinct peoples that are traveling side by side on the same river of life. And before I go too much further, one more. I want to acknowledge that many of the ideas I will share with you today will appear in a forthcoming chapter that I co-authored with my partner and collaborator in all things from parenting to scholarship, Dr. David Gibson. So as I kick off, I really want to pose a series of questions. And I'll start with this one. And it's something I'll invite you to reflect on. Is what exactly do you mean? What do we mean when we think about the concept of academic integrity? I'm posing this question because often I hear people refer to academic integrity as though that is the problem. We have a problem with academic integrity. But of course, it's the reverse. The problem is not with integrity. The problem is with the absence of integrity, with violations of integrity. So just a small reminder to be a little more careful with our language over here, that integrity is not the problem over here. But more to the point, I suspect I'm not the only person in the physical room or the digital room for that matter, who notice people using the term academic integrity as shorthand for student academic misconduct. Right? We hear that a lot. And I say students specifically because, of course, in my role as Vice Provost Teaching and Learning, but certainly as a fellow, as a lay faculty member before that as well, I've noticed that many educators who for years have been working to address cheating and plagiarism in the classroom or in online learning environments have, of course, themselves been modeling plagiarism by, for example, looking online for images in Google image search and pasting them into slide decks without attribution. I always find that somewhat comical. But I want to acknowledge that when we talk about academic integrity, this is not limited to the behavior of students. This applies very much to us as well. And that's really the focus of what I'm trying to address today, is our choices, our design decisions. And this is why I think it's important to note that the International Center for Academic Integrity's definition is really about academic integrity as a commitment, even in the face of adversity, to these 6 fundamental values, as they call them. So honesty, fairness, respect, responsibility, trust, and courage. And nothing in this definition, of course, limits this concept to the behavior or the work of students. By the way, and I'm pleased to see you up with your camera already. Every slide, and there's a lot in which I have reports, articles, books, websites, infographics. I have an abundance of QR codes coming at you. So you might want to keep your camera on ready. Feel free. But this also, I think, leads to the next question, which is, of course, how can we as educators approach our work with academic integrity? And specifically, how do we ensure that our decisions around the design of the learning environment reflect those same values? So honesty, fairness, respect, responsibility, trust, and courage, even in the face of adversity, as the center says. And I'm stressing adversity again, because it feels like for the last several years, we faced little but adversity as educators in the space, right? I come with deep empathy and appreciation for the work of educators who, having navigated the trials of the pandemic and remote emergency teaching, were only hit by another tidal wave of change with generative artificial intelligence, of course. But let's talk about the pandemic first, because of course, as you know, when COVID-19 hit our campuses, associated public health orders shuttered not only formal learning environments like classrooms and labs, but also informal learning environments like libraries, for example, and student centers. It meant that these spaces had to be closed. People had to work from home, whether or not educators or students were equipped to do so from their households. Think about students with parental responsibilities, for example, multi-generational households. All sorts of assumptions people made about whether or not the switch to online learning could take place very easily. It led universities to move all instruction online, whether or not educators or learners were accustomed to these tools or these platforms or these delivery modes. It moved learning resources, learning activities, learning assessments into digital platforms, whether or not educators or learners had equitable access to the necessary computing devices, reliable high-speed internet access and peripherals, particularly at a time when the cost of those things were hiking up pretty quickly. And it did so, of course, just as instructors and students alike were grappling with uncertainty, with anxiety, with fear, and a sudden loss of agency that resulted from these unwanted, but of course necessary changes at the time. And so considering that many faculty members sought to retain as much as possible of what was familiar at the time, it is no surprise that synchronous online delivery and high-stakes online examinations emerged as the modal, most common instructional practices at the time, despite contrary advice from most centers for teaching and learning to focus on flexibility and compassion and kindness. Now, as some instructors who had ported their in-person pedagogies into online spaces, I think tired of speaking to a series of black boxes, I again will remark a series of observations from my perspective. What might have previously been ableist laptop bans in the physical classroom very quickly were replaced with ableist camera-on policies for online teaching and learning as well. It was never about the laptops, always about control. And so as rising reports of student cheating fueled concerns of widespread student academic misconduct during online exams, of course, as you know, institutions face loud calls for the implementation of systems that could control and surveil students. And of course, this could be anything from lockdown browsers, as you may be familiar with, to online remote exam proctoring tools as well. And of course, these were a far cry from those earlier calls for compassion and flexibility and kindness. And so looking back, I will say I understand the pressures that led many post-secondary institutions to invest vast sums of money with these educational technology vendor contracts, because they were searching for the silver bullet that would somehow kill online cheating. But in my view, these resources would have been far better spent supporting educators, supporting learners, but particularly educators in the design of more effective and supportive learning environments. But I would say none of the expenses of these contracts come close to the true cost of creating adversarial learning environments that are predicated on a mistrust of students. And so considering remote exam proctoring as a particular tool through the lens of those 6 fundamental values of academic integrity that I outlined earlier, I would say, whether you consider the dishonesty that is represented by the poor efficacy of these tools, the unfairness of the algorithmic biases that, for example, tend to flag students with darker skin tones as cheating, the irresponsibility of ignoring data security breaches, the resulting erosion of trust. Those are just some examples. I'm playing with the same values over here. But it strikes me as something of a perversion of the construct of academic integrity, that these technologies were ever disguised in the costume of ethical decision-making. If anything, I would say that I believe it was courage for institutions to take a proactive stance against such surveillance technologies. And of course, that brings us neatly to generative artificial intelligence. Now, of course, GenAI, and I'm just sharing examples of snapshots from a Microsoft report about this, we know that today this is used widely by students for a wide variety of tasks for learning, whether authorized or not. And that could be anything from brainstorming to get started with assignments, to summarizing information, to getting initial feedback on their work. And we know that GenAI is also widely used by educators, again, to support a range of teaching tasks. Everything from brainstorming ideas for lesson plans and assignments, to simplifying complex topics for students, and to supporting accessibility in the classroom with assistive technologies. It's really important. But with the advent of GenAI, of course, we have once again witnessed the same tendency to lean into surveillance technologies, with many racing to adopt software that purports to detect the use of GenAI in student coursework. I refuse to describe these technologies as AI detection tools, because that's what they purport to do. That's not really what they do. And I do hope that you are all aware at this point that these tools are deeply unreliable. And I would describe them as a form of security theater at this point, expensive security theater. And in fact, I would go further and suggest that based on what we know about these technologies today, using them today, I would regard this as quite unethical. And this is why they are very quickly being dropped by universities everywhere from Australia to Canada right now. And so just as the ethics of remote exam proctoring flew in the face of the fundamental values of academic integrity, I think so too does the ethics of using GenAI detection tools today. I mean, these tools produce both false negatives and false positives, compromises their accuracy, their reliability. They are known to disproportionately disadvantage specific groups of learners, including those for whom English is a subsequent language. And as with commonly used originality checking platforms such as Turnitin, Gen AI detection tools trample over the intellectual property rights of students while actively monetizing their intellectual labor. And they do so while diverting precious institutional resources away from far more beneficial resources, while reinforcing and breeding an atmosphere of mistrust. Sarah Eden, who's of course a leading scholar of academic integrity, has pointed this out, that it's futile to engage in an academic integrity arms race. Because with the emergence of any new technology, you see a range of reactions, of course, excitement and worry and panic, existential dread, what you like. And of course, then teachers and students both figure out how to use the new technology, whether it's for teaching or for learning, or sure, for cheating as well. But then, of course, more tech is developed to catch students, or at least to attempt to catch students using the technology who are using it to violate academic integrity. But eventually, students will find workarounds. And let me tell you, there are 1,000, 1,000,000, countless Reddit threads that spring up with students sharing all of these creative ways to get around these technologies. It's always been easy. And the sad part is it's easier for students with, whether it's purchasing a second device, whether it is hardware workarounds or other tools. Now in TAXA, which is Australia's tertiary education quality and standards authority, they've correctly outlined that it is not viable to ignore Gen AI today. It is also not viable to attempt to ban its use, especially as I pointed out, you really cannot detect its use. So good luck with banning it. Instead, TAXA says you really have three options when it comes to learning assessment. I'm not sure I agree with all of their philosophy of it, but I'll just outline it quickly. The first one they say is to invigilate, which is what is number 3 on that list. Now, I would suggest that this is problematic to some degree for reasons that include giving up many of the gains that we've made when it comes to student access, student flexibility. There are logistical challenges with scale, of course, as well, along with the fact that this is also not foolproof. Sarah was at my campus recently, and she demonstrated this lovely pair of smart glasses. I have a pair as well, and this is just the first generation. It's powered by ChatGPT. It projects on a little screen that only I can see when I'm wearing the glasses, nobody else can see. And the glasses even come in a prescription lens format. So good luck with prohibiting the use of those as well. So again, to some degree, invigilation is increasing the theater as well. It makes us feel perhaps just that modicum of greater comfort. Like, you witness other people taking their shoes off as they walk through airport security. It's not really making you safer. You just need to think yourself up. And that's just the first generation of those tools. They are, of course, going to rapidly get much, much better. One could embrace, which is, where is it? The green one, fourth down from the top. But I would say this is also done far too often in a way that pays lip service to the many real ethical considerations with AI. And that includes everything from equity and privacy to intellectual property, environmental impact, algorithmic bias, but also the pedagogical considerations. Everything from cognitive offloading and the de-skilling that results from that to the erosion of trust in the classroom. So from my perspective, I really think that rethink is the path forward, the one at the bottom, even though it certainly does take a lot more time and effort. But the rethink has to be grounded in criticality. It has to be grounded in ethical reasoning. Because if we are not careful, we could very easily find ourselves in this world where students are submitting AI-generated responses that are then auto-graded by AI-driven grading platforms. It's fantastically efficient, which is, of course, the Silicon Valley wet dream, but none of it has to do with the business of education. And I would say this is even easier now with the advent of agentic AI, because already right now you can have instructors who hand over their login credentials to, let's say, OpenAI's agent mode, and students as well. Students can delegate the completion of online exams and discussion forums to agentic AI. This is AI that requires far less human intermediation at this point, even though the students will be in violation, no doubt, of university IT policies. And instructors could do the same, right? Give the login credentials and have the agent mark the student's work, the learning assessment. This is already possible. It's likely already happening in a way that cannot really be detected. And I'm sharing this because, I'm not trying to make you panic, but I will say there are many paradoxes and many pitfalls with AI in this way. I mean, you can see the great race with AI to make knowledge more widely available, but it's done in a way that makes hallucinations and misinformation very widely available. You talk about the desire to personalize education, which is a big buzzword with AI promoters. But of course, it's done curiously in a way that's incredibly impersonal and somehow removes the human from this so-called personalized education. I get amused by that. There's rhetoric around the democratization of education, but of course, what we really see is an oligopoly, increasingly the privatization of education through a philosophy of neoliberalism. You see a strong desire to draw on as large a corpus as possible of training data, but it's done in a way that actually steals intellectual property from artists, from writers, from scholars. You hear promises around widening access, but of course, you can see the many ways in which it is widening inequity. And don't want you to get me wrong over here. I'm not saying there are no good possibilities with AI either, but the risks are significant. And from my perspective, if we do not engage with AI critically, including considering whether or not it's even appropriate to engage with AI, not just assuming it's the thing to do, we will do harm. And I think that's also why, for me, one of the most interesting paradoxes to emerge in this space is with an increasing desire for students to emerge with AI literacy and fluency, in fact, technological training, is increasingly an importance of humanistic education. What we need more than ever is critical reasoning, it's ethical reasoning, it's communication, it's collaboration, is humanity. And I will say, I will urge you not to let people gaslight you into thinking that adopting a critical approach with AI is somehow anti-tech, anti-progress, stuck in the mud, denialist or traditionalist. Frankly, that is an intellectually dishonest argument. So, what do we do? What are the next steps? I think that's where I'm interested in the discussion to come, but I'll point to a few possibilities. I do think we need to review very clearly our learning outcomes. If some of them are not relevant anymore, if students are not able to quickly understand the relevance of what we're doing with them in the classroom or online, if they don't clearly see the link between the learning activities, the learning assessments, and the skills and competencies they need to develop, it may well be that some of what we're doing is not relevant anymore. And if it is relevant, they're not understanding that it's relevant and that they're hampering and jeopardizing their futures by actively de-skilling themselves. So we do need to review what learning outcomes are still relevant in 2025. We need to rethink learning assessment, and I don't just mean within the context of individual courses. We can think about whether we are over-assessing students. We can think about moving to more programmatic approaches to assessment, and I'll give you an example in a moment of what that looks like. But continuing to push a square peg into a round hole is a bit like sticking to your in-person pedagogies during the pandemic. That is not teaching with academic integrity in 2025, in my view, adopting the same learning assessment style. We need an ethical approach to EdTech. This is where the institution needs to come to the fore, I would suggest. Cannot leave individual educators to their own devices to navigate this space. We need to have support. We need to have guidance. Agile, we need to have some governance over here. We need to not just develop literacies, but critical literacies, so that students can understand, educators can understand what this looks like. When we talk about environmental impact, for example, I was at a meeting a few months ago, and there were some Indigenous educators who shared they operate by the 7th generation principle, which means they make decisions based on the impact 7 generations has. And so if it takes 500 milliliters, roughly 2 cups of water, to cool the servers for a 25 to 45 query back and forth with ChatGPT, the question they said we should be asking ourselves is, whose 2 cups of water am I using? Casual interaction. I thought that was a powerful way to frame that. But we need more of that critical analysis. Institutional policies and support certainly need to adapt, whether we're talking about procurement of EdTech, whether we're talking about intellectual property, including the protection of student IP, of course. And finally, we need to take seriously the values of academic integrity ourselves. I see too often, and other scholars have commented on this, that sometimes the classroom looks like something of a hostage situation instead of a sacred space for learning. It's really bizarre. These are not the conditions, I'm going to quote bell hooks, where student learning can most deeply and intimately begin. We are not caring for the souls of our students. One approach we've taken at Brock University is the development and adoption, approved by our Senate just a few months ago, of an ethical framework for educational technologies. And you're seeing 11 principles. These can be embedded now, whether we're doing a formal request for proposals in a procurement situation, or even if we're simply guiding individual educators making small choices. These are some of the principles we need to attend to now at Brock. This is blanket across the board. We do not want to be procuring ableist technologies that we then need to retrofit because they are inaccessible, would be a simple example. We do not want to connect our learning management system to the student information system in a way that defaults to legal names, because in doing so, we will dead name our trans students. There's a host of ethical considerations that go well beyond GenAI. So that's been our approach. Instead of just having a GenAI conversation, we're going to have a bigger conversation about this, a more proactive conversation. Another thing I think we can do is draw on the work of scholarship from people like Sarah Eamon, who I've referred to already before. This was developed by her and her colleague Rahul Kumar, who is, of course, a faculty member at Brock as well. It is their post-plagiarism framework. And if you're unfamiliar with this concept, they're helping us to move beyond traditional notions of cheating and plagiarism in an age where human-AI hybrid writing is increasingly common. And I'm not going to go through all of the tenets of this. The infographic will be there for you to look at. And apologies if part of it is cut off. I'm happy to make these slides available to everybody who's attending, whether in person or online, so you can dive a bit deeper. But the gist of this is we cannot be thinking the same way about knowledge, control of knowledge, and access to knowledge when the nature of the etymology of knowledge is changing so swiftly. We should also draw on work like this. This is a wonderful book that I strongly recommend. It's by Tricia Bertram-Gallant and David Rettinger, called The Opposite of Cheating. And it's filled with fantastic, useful guidance, both at the course level and at the institutional level. But they help make the point that you cannot really design a course to make it cheating-proof. But you can actually design a course to increase the likelihood of cheating. That's very easy to do. If you have all or nothing deadlines with no flexibility, that's a terrific example. If you're not making it so that students have some flexibility in there, a student who hasn't finished their assignment midnight before it's due, they're going to make a choice between using GenAI and violating academic integrity and getting a 0 on the assignment. You give them more flexibility, even if it's a few more marks off, some sort of limit, or maybe it's not marks, maybe you're adjusting the amount of feedback you're able to give them. You give me the assignment by this day, you'll get the most feedback. 2 days after that, you'll get a little less feedback. 2 days after that, you'll get no feedback. There are lots of ways in which you can design things that drive up cheating because you're incentivizing it at that point, right? If we overemphasize grades instead of learning, we will increase academic misconduct. But more than anything, I would say we really should not be reverting to carceral pedagogies, because it's easy to envision an environment today where we invite students into a large examination theater. We take DNA swabs from their cheeks on the way in to make sure they are where they say they are. We then close them in a Faraday cage, so there's no Wi-Fi or any sort of signal that can come and go. This is not education. That's a carceral approach, and I think we need to stay away from that. I think we can draw inspiration from what's happening in places like Melbourne, which is really interesting. I'm not saying this is exactly the approach everybody needs to take, but the University of Melbourne is moving over the next couple of years to a system where they've identified a few approaches to assessment that are relatively more secure. Again, not perfect, but some, and then others that are not. And so what they're saying is at least 50% of the program level outcomes must be assessed through secure methods within a span of a couple of years. They're also focusing on programmatic assessment a lot more than simply individual course-based assessment. So it could be capstone assessments at the end of a particular year upon the declaration of a major. Other ways where you look at the student's journey across the length of a degree. When do you think they're developing, or should they be developing, key competencies? When are the right points to assess those competencies? And for the most part, stop over-assessing them. Take off the pressure. Lean into assessment for learning, not just assessment of learning. Lean into formative developmental assessment as well. It's going to be interesting to see how that goes. And they're trying to figure out how to scale up things like interactive oral assessments, which is not easy to scale up. So, but I appreciate that they're trying to do something different in the space, and we can learn from their lessons over the next while. And then finally, I will say it is really, really important not to forget to partner with students as we're charting the future. And I love this example. It comes from the London School of Economics, where they published a student manifesto for assessment in the age of AI. And it helps dispel myths about what students think about AI, because for the most part, they're really interested in moving towards a culture of transparency and trust. They are attentive to inequities when it comes to access. And they really want to, again, move beyond this notion of terror of being accused of violating academic integrity. And so where I will finish is just by saying I think we do need to take our destiny in our own hands over here. I think there's a lot of people worried about the future of higher education right now. But I do think we need to rethink what education looks like today. Beyond rethinking, we must educate students, as I said, about the relevance of the knowledge and skills that they need to develop, the direct relevance of the learning activities and assessments that lead to that development. Along the way, we will have to educate governments, no doubt. We will have to educate industry, absolutely, who tend to forget about the importance of humanistic education, only then to realize, oops, we forgot about that. And now we have a robot that doesn't understand ethics and solves the trolley game by running over even more people, for example. We also need to educate accrediting bodies. So again, we are not simply at the mercy of bodies that say, well, no, we need online remote exam proctoring. No, we need to educate them about the problems of this approach. We are the people we've been waiting for. We're not at the mercy of these forces. So playing an active role in education for our students, but government, industry, and accrediting bodies as well. And finally, I think just doing everything in our power to push back against this prevailing transactional model of education, because that's really what's eating away at this for us. Education at its best is, of course, transformative, not transactional. It is liberatory. It is accessible in an equitable way. And that's, I think, the future that I think we can help shape if we do our job. So I will stop there, but thank you very, very much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. That was absolutely excellent. So I'm going to ask our panelists if they could come up to the panelists, if they could come up and sit here at the front, please.
You see, it's left down. And it was there. That's pretty good. I'll just pick the podium to ask the question. Right. Listen, yeah, I can't pause the conversation.
Just ask the panel, please introduce yourself while I'm just getting set up here and I'll get some water. So we could do that for the benefit of everyone here, and everyone online, please.
I'm Mary Claire Kennedy. I am academic integrity lead at the University of Limerick and the chair of NAIN. I'm a pharmacist by training and came to academic integrity through a slightly circuitous route. I was chair of the plagiarism committee in a school of healthcare in the University of Leeds, which sounds really quaint now. That's the plagiarism was a problem. And so that's how I landed in Limerick. And I think, my true calling is around kind of questions relating to integrity, assessment, education. I think it took me a little while to find them, but here I am. Thank you very much.
I'm James Brunton. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Psychology, background in social and organizational psychology, and I'm chair of fully online open education undergraduate psychology.
I'm Samantha Jiaxin. I'm the academic integrity officer at DCU for around 2 years and a half. Before coming to DCU 2.5 years ago, I was teaching academic writing for over a decade, well, nearly a decade. So I think I'm really interested in thinking about academic integrity not as a punitive approach, but as a developmental growing approach. And I focus a lot on educational design and involved with the policy making of academic integrity. Forward to shaping.
Dr David Gibson. I'm an assistant professor in School of Human Development in the IOE. Philosopher, background in bioethics. And in addition to the lecturing, I'm chair of an ethics committee. I'm interested in the overlap frequently between academic integrity, research integrity, and the obligation to those values as they correspond to participation.
Thank you very much, our amazing panelists. And now you can relax, because that's the hardest thing you can do tonight. Introduce yourself, speak about your own self for 2 minutes. Now the pressure is off. and we're going to have a wide-ranging, freewheeling discussion. We can go wherever it takes you. So if you've anything you want to say in response to what Rajiv was saying, please do. And as a prompt, my first question to you is, and I can maybe work from my left to right here to Dr. Mary Claire first, and say, just ask you about the kind of what was very interesting, what came through in lots of the examples we heard about designing learning environments. We heard a lot about the problems. We know about the problems. We heard about more problems. But is there anything that anything nice? It was really interesting to hear the way students are kind of hacking their way through these things. They're finding, they're finding workarounds, they're finding loopholes. Sometimes that's to the things like using AI or using things computer-based. Sometimes they're trying to make learning environments more accessible to themselves. The problems we have, they have to hack through. But so my question for you, Dr. Kennedy, is what does assessment or learning environment design with integrity look like mean in your context, or have you an example of that?
Yeah, so thanks very much. I was fascinating talk, and really interesting. There's such vast literature out there and guidance. It was really great to distill it down into key concepts. So thank you for that. I think I always kind of take a step back about what do we mean by academic integrity, and you as well challenged us to think about what we mean by that. And I suppose our first protocol sometimes could be heading into policing, clamping things down. And I very much welcome that opportunity to step back and rethink about what remains valuable and true to us in this new environment. How have our professional standards, expectations shifted? And maybe that is not something that we can arrive at a single answer in this moment of time. It might be something that we have to revisit over time. And particularly this kind of this idea about transformative rather than transactional education. And I think that's really something that we have to hold on to, that essentially we have a fantastic opportunity to meet young minds, really enthusiastic, and essentially they are excited for their lifetime of work or their lifetime of contribution to society. And it is our responsibility as educators to equip them with skills, knowledge to go out into the world. And so I think rather than us setting parameters or rules or diktats about this is my expectation, it's our duty actually to look outwards the world, see where professions are headed, what expectations and skill sets there are for workers, and keep abreast of that, and really be quite proactive. And that's so challenging for educators to constantly have to re-examine what we're doing. But I think at the rate and pace of change, and rightfully the expectations of our learners to be prepared for their future lives, we have to be up for that challenge of really looking at assessment, and like that at a programmatic level, not saying, well, I'm minding my own patch here in my module, actually collaborate with other educators around us, really upholding that duty that we have to provide a transformative educational experience. Thank you.
That's excellent. That's so interesting about being ready to meet the students, that they're coming to us like that, and the programmatic lens, I'm sure. It's a nice segue to you, James. You've done a lot of work in this space, but I don't know what does academic integrity look like to you in your context?
In thinking about this, I wanted to go really grounded and just talk about some assessments that I've been working on myself the last few months, and what I've been trying to do in general, but then specifically around trying to look at some assessments and thinking, okay, how vulnerable are they to old school, grazing the internet, shallow scraping of, different sources, and then Gen AI. So I had a social psychology essay that over time had shifted around a bit. It was now worth a bit more than I thought it should as a straightforward essay. And then I would state that before the arrival of Gen AI. So I shifted what that assessment now is to being from an essay style to a literature review style assessment, still a written assessment. But in combination with the lit review, they also have to complete a critical reading log where they have to say, this is a source that I read, this is what I've taken from that. This is how I think it fits into the way that my lit review has come together. And I think combining those two things, it makes it a little bit harder to use a generative AI tool or to take a very surface level, shallow approach even without using Gen AI tools, and have that assessment hang together in terms of what the student submits. And the critical reading log, all the stuff around that, around critical reading and critical writing, is coming from the curriculum. So it's not extra evidence your process activity that just increases workload. I think there's a modest maybe increasing workload of the students and the markers, but it's still very core to what we're trying to develop in the students anyway. And then there was a qualitative research methods assignment, and I was working, I don't even think this is that much about AI, but I was working on how they were going to evidence not only putting a research report together at the end of an assignment where they have to design an interview, do an interview, and then analyze a number of interviews together using Envivo, basically. But I had to work on, okay, what should your Envivo file look like if you want to submit that as an appendix? What goes into the appendix of the assessments? And I was trying to align that as closely as possible to basically what I would do in a research project. What would I have in my folders? What would I be sending to my collaborators? So again, it's like that would be a difficult assessment to use generative AI to produce because of the amount of pieces of the process you're having to evidence at the end. But in having to evidence that process, you are basically learning exactly what I would do when I'm doing research. So I think it's authentic. I think it has integrity. They're not being asked to evidence anything in kind of a superficial or mechanistic way, just so we know we can see the inside of the process. So that's like I don't know how good it is.
It's a really nice.
See how.
Thank you very much, James. It's very interesting. And it was interesting what you said at first about the link between surface level work that students might be doing and the things that ChatGPT can do, because we're working with multiple problems. We're still working with the core problem of learning and getting students to do deep learning, regardless of whether it's cheating or something else. So it's kind of balancing all of that. And you gave us a very in-depth view in the weeds of your practice.
Welcome to the trenches.
Now, you're out, you're looking at all the gardens, right? You're not in the weeds, you're looking at all the gardens, you're seeing all the gardens at DCU. So what do you think? What does academic integrity look like in your context?
I want to first respond a little bit to what I heard in the example from James. I felt this sense of coherence built into the learning process and making students see at the very end how everything comes together as a whole piece. And it makes them see the purpose of learning. So just quoting some people here from Susan Gottlober, she did a research, a QQI funded research, and one of the findings was students are more likely to be academic misconduct if they feel the content is not meaningful and not relevant. So I just want to throw that there. I see James' example is telling them everything you do throughout the process of the assessment is meaningful to you because it's helping you to develop overall. And apart from that, I'm just thinking about a little bit add on to Gen AI, which is it's not obligation for you as a teacher to have to design in Gen AI in learning. The goal is about, as Rajiv said, is whether your learning outcomes have been achieved. If you could ensure students not using AI can achieve the learning outcomes, there's no obligation of using Gen AI, but you have to learn Gen AI because it's impacting assessments. Finally, I want to add a little bit on interactive oral assessments because it was originated from Griffith University in Australia. It's called interactive oral because it's not a Viva-like question and answer type of assessment. It's interactive, it's unscripted, free-flowing conversation between the assessor and the student. So you have that quite authentic mode in the assessment mode in the first place. And you can see the student in the live session, you see them, you hear them, so that level of engagement where both students and staff enjoy their experience of doing the interactive oral. But apart from that, I suppose a lot of staff, when they're taking a new module or teaching a module, they didn't really create the assessment from scratch. They just took whatever assessment was there from past years. But if they're engaged in some kind of innovative assessment design, such as interactive oral, they are forced to look back at the assessment design, at the constructive alignment. They have to, they're kind of pushed to create and improve their rubrics to make sure it really measures what learning outcomes should measure. And finally, they have to use real life situations, which I suppose the authentic element in the assessment, making it meaningful for students and possibly relate back to what Mary Claire said about, the professional ethics, professional skills needed looking forward. So.
Excellent, thanks so much, Sam. That's really interesting, and that you link back to something you said, or James as well, actually all about that relevance to students of what they're doing is very powerful. And yet we have a very, Lily and Martina and many others doing great work, and we have a very vibrant interactive work community of practice from the university supporting each other. That's kind of important in these things as well, that whatever we're going to do, we take a strategic approach. Maybe one university does something particular Gen AI, one's doing something around unflowed activities or whatever it might be, and it's very interesting. So David, Dr. David Gibson from our School of Human Development, what strikes you about what does academic integrity look like in your context and designing with integrity?
So there's kind of 2 or 3 things. I think what academic integrity, but advising accountability on academic and to acknowledge what they're complicit in. And I think what AI and COVID did was it wasn't forced it on us very quickly. It made visible what had just been accepted, that we will do assessment the way we want to do, privileged in narrative form of a particular type. And we're struggling with that now. And I think I take from to then the challenge that this presents as to how much we can move beyond not transactional education, transactional approaches to our work within education as academics, and how we, whether we need external validation and reward from our university and our peers to act with integrity. And I think the challenge to embedding academic integrity is a question of from where do academic staff want recognition? And is that from their own practice with their students? Is it from promotion committees? Is it from external? And so there's that side, which I think is what we have to deal with. And then I think where the kind of the particular challenges in designing and integrity, I think are when we move to working with multiple colleagues, with multiple sites of engagement. So if we take it in terms of something like research ethics, where you can have an ethics committee, you can have a program chair, you can have supervisors, you can have students, and you can and all of those have a very different approach, rightly, to what is academic integrity. And that is going to lead necessarily to defensiveness and a transactional approach of staff because time is precious. So I view academic integrity as a real challenge to whether we can really shift our obligation toward creating really dynamic learning environment. And then finally on this idea of the privileging of the narrative word and wider discussions in Irish academia is we are preparing a subset of our students, whether that's undergraduate or postgraduate, for this reified narrative approach to expression, which is the exemplified in the academic who writes for a living, whereas the vast majority of our students, sort of 90% at doctoral level, are not going to go into the academy. So it's a question of, well, what are our programs and our assessments and our learning environment for? And I think there is much about us rather than being oriented always to the real world that our students develop.
That was very provocative and interesting. A lot we can unpack with the recognition, certainly, and all of that. So, and I think what I kind of took from that, what resonated with me certainly is like, how do we hold each other accountable for building shared worlds? And what does that like everything says? So I'm going to ask us all again, maybe another question I'm going to put to the panel this time. And if you've already feel like you've answered this, okay, just you can expand on your previous answer or those of your fellow panelists or speakers. But if you could zoom up to the institutional level and think about kind of what would you do at a higher level if you were designing the policy, what would that look like? Maybe you're doing that, or maybe you're not. So maybe you have some unique experience or not, and you can answer this from any perspective you like. I was doing a workshop recently with Gen AI with teachers, and we talked about policy. And the first thing we did, we got them to design the worst possible policy you can that would actually ruin what you're trying to do. You know, think of policy fails. Or you could think about a wish list of the absolute lovely things you would need in a policy. But what would designing with integrity for integrity look like at an institutional level? Do you have any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, so I have the privilege and challenge both to form policy, particularly around academic integrity, but also I suppose around Gen AI within our institution, but then thinking nationally with NAIN as well, thinking about how we, build robust frameworks or kind of the way with academic integrity, and then thinking about AI as parts of that challenge and maybe opportunity as well. So come at it with a few different lenses. I suppose at my heart, I'm a healthcare professional, and most of the time I approach things about co-production involving the end user. So and that kind of that phrase, no decision about me without me, I kind of bring into most things in life. And so I really think it's important we have principles of co-production embedded in everything we do. And it's easy to throw around that word co-design or co-production and have students in a room and educators and whoever else is affected by a policy and pay lip service to that, but actually really meaningfully trying to tease out views, perceptions, and try and meaningfully integrate them into policy. And that takes time, as it's more than just a few meetings and I tick that box of co-production. So I think firstly, that's something we really have to strive, and I'm not sure, as I say, it might require revisiting depending on how the external landscape is shifting with how we integrate AI into our work and our future personal lives, etc. I suppose what I want to kind of maybe hone in on is this idea of we often say, Gen AI will be transformative for learning and teaching and assessment practices, and we need to teach critical literacy, and we kind of, and that sounds like a good and reasonable thing to say. But we're having a community of practice meeting this week in our university, and we're reading a paper by Flenady, apologies if that's wrong, from the Journal of Teaching and Higher Education, and titled "Cut the BS." I won't do the BS, but it's a really interesting. Two philosophers have written it, and they talk about it's not enough to simply say, oh, you've got to teach your students critical literacy and critical thinking skills and let them off then with the AI. That actually nearly ignores the role of the educator, in that we as educators, we are critical in that relationship. It is a one-to-one relationship with the student and the educator. It's not the student and the AI. And we can't forget or even offload our responsibilities as educators. So thinking, yes, wonderfully about all these innovative things we could do with AI and teaching and assessment, it actually has to go back to basics, in that we have a responsibility to learners to make sure they understand content, they are developing skill set, are developing critical thinking skills, and not kind of saying, well, you're to understand what critical literacy is in relation to the AI. And I think kind of so it's easy to put in these kind of buzzwords into policies and say, well, teach AI literacy, but really actually what does that mean, and what does that mean for educators, and is that just an easy way out? So I actually think really refreshingly we're going back to the basics of education, and it's like you said, it's about a live classroom and a dynamic and interactive thing. Sure, AI is there, but it's not the instructor in the room. And I think our challenge with policies is to go back to the basics of education, while also kind of mindful on all these kinds of new and exciting technologies that do help us, but really are they the thing that teach people and help them to go out into the world act in a responsible and inquiring way.
Co-design and co-production as though we have a community of practice here for people here in DCU. We have students as partners. Rob Lammy sitting down there as well. Talk to him, and someone put a link in the chat or COP on that. And James, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm picking up. I'm applying a lot of things that people are already saying. I mean, again, when you start talking about an academic integrity policy, that tends to be the policy for when it's breached. You know, if you flip it around, I mean, as you were saying, if you flip it around, you're really just talking about the way we do business. You know, you're just talking about a teaching and learning policy, or just the way the institution functions in terms of how we teach students. But like, I think my big thing, and it's almost like apologies, people used to me speak anywhere because I tend to come back to the same arguments. Like, this kind of policy is relatively meaningless unless there's systematic accountability for how that policy would be acted in context. So, you know, a couple of the things that we have, you know, in Ireland, like that might be different across different jurisdictions, but people teaching in higher education, there is no mandatory level of training that you have to do before you go into a class and start working with students. And from that point down, professional development is left to the individual in terms of what they engage with, what they don't engage with. You then have an academic culture that might incentivize work to be focused on particular areas. You know, promotion, what does promotion recognize and not recognize? What you have to do to get that promotion, what you have to do to get the job in the first place. Within that, there is a demonstrated issue with capacity and workload in higher education. So something like the pandemic comes along, the example's been given already. All of a sudden it was, okay, learn a completely different skill set. Some people may have developed themselves, some institutions may have supported people develop themselves to a point where that wasn't that challenging. For other people, this was completely challenging because maybe they didn't have the tech skills, they didn't have the pedagogical skills to do that easily. A couple of years later, generative AI comes out and we replicate the exact same scenario. I don't think we learned anything from the pandemic in terms of how strategically support people to be at a level of skills and to want to be at the level of skills and to be recognized in the institution for attaining that level of skills, so that something comes along, people are just adding that on. They're just applying their skills to this new thing that comes out. But instead what we have is maybe you could have someone who they haven't done a lot in teaching and learning. They do their teaching, you know, they're managing their overall workload across research, teaching and learning and service. A kind of a request comes out that, okay, we just need you now to fundamentally rethink your teaching and learning, your assessment, in the context of everything about this new disruptive technology. You're just kind of harming that person because they have no capacity to do that work, and they have no capacity within their workload to accomplish that, even if they wanted to. So like, my radically boring thing is, you know, people started to talk about AI literacy when we had perfectly good digital literacy frameworks that already existed. We weren't doing the work to action those in already. Why would we move on to something that specifically calls out AI literacy, as if it's some kind of unicorn that doesn't exist in context? So my radically boring, my radically mundane approach is we should just take the tools that we had and get back to the work that wasn't being done in the first place, and take a look at the kind of the systemic changes that need to be made in order to position people so they can do the work that we're saying they should be doing. And also the thing is, stop talking about AI, because, you know, kind of AI will solve everything, or AI is the devil and is ruining everything. Those are both AI tech discourses that AI companies want us to be having, because it means they've taken up the real estate in our heads.
Thank you very much, James. You flipped the script there, certainly, and it follows lovely from there's talk about the value of teaching and the importance of that, both of your kind of shared passions.
And the back to basics.
Back to basics and the disciplinary ethos.
To be honest, I know James for a while, and I know how I think, well, founded, he has these concerns throughout these years. I can't agree with you more. That should be a lot of support also from the top instead of making all of the tasks passed on to individual staff. I want to mention a bit more back to the policies, general policies, some basic issues with the policies. Let's say I ask you, do you know where to find our academic integrity policy, DCU website, as well as our procedure for academic misconduct? Maybe half of you, I guess. So I saw that I want to mention the problem of accessibility of the document at the first place by staff and students. I think there needs to be increased visibility and accessibility of that. Apart from that, again, borrowing research from Cullen and Murphy about one of the issue of the language used in academic integrity policy wouldn't be too difficult, coming from a solicitor, language where only other solicitors could understand. So they're suggesting about using the FK scale to evaluate the accessibility, readability of the language, make sure it's written there and it's also well understood and interpreted, especially for students. I think, yeah, that's about +1 strategy in terms of the policy. Second of all, I think co-partnership at DCU, we involve student representatives in our subcommittee of academic integrity when we're reviewing the policies, reviewing the procedures, as well as creating new policy and procedures. So I think we should keep doing that, because it's the same, mostly same staff teaching, but it's new students coming every year. Whether they experience COVID or not, whether they experience GenAI or some new technology. I think Sarah mentioned about the neural links technology, the neural technology that could be used for cheating. So GenAI is not surely the beginning of the concerns of technology. 2 more strategies about policies, again quoting Gail Barnes and others at the University of Glasgow. She mentioned about the consistency of the policy, where the policy should be aligned and what do we call it, to be aligned in the content, the space for academic learning resources in our VLE should be aligned with the library tutorials online. There should be that consistency to not confuse students. Finally, is the discipline-specific part. It would be good to have this university-wide policy, but each discipline is different. Quoting Monica Ward, our Dean of Teaching and Learning, that misconduct in School of Computing looks so different from the misconduct in School of English. So it would be good to have both the university-wide policy and discipline-specific guidance to make it more, easy to proceed the actions of academic integrity or misconduct procedure in the school level.
So interesting. It's like it's academic integrity is plural. It's like AI. There's multiple AIs. Academic integrity is going to look different in every discipline. These signature pedagogies. The readability is such a key thing. I get my students. We look at the privacy policies of AI tools that are being promoted in education. We do a bit of work on them in one of my classes, and it's fascinating. They just probably could make no sense. They don't just. David, over to you, your policy, please.
So I think 2 things. One question, going back to what Mary Fair said, I think we need to reimagine and think about the nature of the relationship between educator and students. And that shift has happened in other disciplines. We can think about it in medicine, we can think about it in some domains of therapy, sometimes associated with humanistic medicine, but more narrative medicine, that we're co-constructing narratives, healing narratives, recovery narratives, or not positive narratives, but they're co-constructed. And that is about challenging knowledge matter. And I think then building on that, we need to see that the policies of the university support more agentic students. So it's not that they have critical knowledge and critical literacy. It's where are we embedding into the university the opportunities for them to be critically agentic? And we note how depoliticized our students are. They won't challenge us. We can use policies and misconduct, but where is their drawing on the critical literacies they have to challenge our practices? And we need to have more relational processes that allow them to hold us to account as opposed to it being adversarial at the get-go. And those same problems have been there in medicine and law as to how do we have a more relational or human engagement that is supportive of students, that looks for more agency from both students and patients, whatever the context. And so that's very hard at a policy level to achieve. I think that is a culture of a university, and the policies can be designed to support that. But this is beyond what policies are, about how we envision how education should happen as a third.
That's fascinating, David, and I like you very much to the first, but you're completely wrong. We don't need agency anymore. We now have agentic AI. Oh, stop. We've solved that problem. We have agentic AI.
In the body, agentic AI.
We have that solved. I can't believe it. So we'd love to open the floor for questions here. Either people online or people from the floor here at DCU. If they'd like to ask a question to our speaker on our panel, please do.
Eamon's present.
If I don't have a question, I just comment about that point.
Sure thing, Cora. Please go.
It's just when you talk about the seventh generation, the indigenous population, and everything else is just a noise for me. Apart from that, that's the bit I really think I'd like to focus on. And the other thing you said as well was that a lot of what we do is medication on this trust first. So I think it's going back to Dave's thing, the relation as well. We can get so busy with the nuts and bolts, we actually forget the bigger picture. And that's what I really take away.
Thank you, Cora, for that. Yeah, Samantha, please.
I just want to add on to that. I think, again, the language or the tone of what we perceive from academic integrity policy is we think if students are engaged in misconduct, their lack of moral ethics. But some of the causes of academic misconduct could be different. For example, cultural differences of understanding plagiarism, for example, individualistic culture, collective culture, or simply just not knowing what to do the reference accurately. So I suppose, we're apart from being like a court, we give them sanction, we have an extra role to play there is to turn that into a teachable opportunity, maybe. I know Courageous Conversations developed by, in Australia, also applied in the University of Galway. They allow students, if they admit that they made a misconduct, and they are also honestly detailing how the misconduct was taking place. No further formal investigations would be proceeded to tell them, you do this. Courageous conversation, it needs courage, one of the value of academic integrity, to admit a mistake, so to avoid it, and you get better in the future. I think that educational element hopefully adds a little more agency in the growth journey in the university would be more hopeful as opposed to.
Yeah, please.
Just a thought on language, I think it's very important. We're in an environment now where there's a lot of international mobility, and I'm looking at plagiarism myself for research. I don't post plagiarism in the same conversation as generally. I also find that the language that's being used in policies is absolutely essential in terms of the understanding. So, for example, in Asian cultures, in America, in Australia, I followed it up on Texas. The definition of academic integrity and plagiarism is different. There's different language use. So we can't assume when somebody arrives in Ireland to study here in one of the HEIs that they automatically engage in the definition of what we believe academic integrity is. So I think there's a whole training element, not just for the learner, but also for the education. The language is crucial, that there's no ambiguity in any of the words used or the description, and to certainly not be using the language of punishment. And you were talking earlier about lawyers speak. I think all of that is so important.
But also at the same time, just again thinking about the pyramid, framework shared by Kay Murdoch and Kat Ellis. Unfortunately, students can be grouped into a band of champions to be compliers, could be careless and chancers and criminals. Unfortunately, there are always people trying to beat the system. I'm not saying we should be too kind that we don't have our bottom line. The standards needs to be guardrails there, but just we have to be more thinking about those we could develop with a pedagogy of care, of that more co-partner approach.
Yeah, I think five off that as well. Yeah, about being careful with language. I mean, it's a tightrope, isn't it? Because I mean, you've got students who are doing their level best, you know, in keeping with sets and briefs, and then you'll always have people in life that will seek to go outside of that. And so there is a balance about having some level of enforcement. I mean, my experience over the years, I've unfortunately managed, I'd say, hundreds of cases now of different problematic behaviours around assessments. The very thing to say, I would say 99% there is a human story of difficulty, challenge, something else. Somebody hasn't arrived at a point to know this is a good thing to do. And I think these kind of conversations around breaches of academic integrity, how we're going to frame them, are actually an opportunity for remediation, intervention, finding help for people, pointing them in the right direction. And I often kind of say an aspect, I would consider myself to fail as an academic integrity lead if I'm getting lots of one particular population or one particular ethnicity or something in front of me. It means I'm failing in some kind of way where these people are being caught in a net and we're not actually intervening further back to ensure that they're not caught up in this kind of punitive system. There will always, as I say, there will always have to be some kind of system. But are really going to go for more kind of holistic interventions further back. And if they come to a misconduct panel and if that's where we find them, then we can offer the help if that's necessary.
So I'm going to take a question online. We're probably down to near our last question, and I have a question from Dr. Alison Egan from Marino, and it's around why we are creating specific AI policies. Should policies not be more general? Once the AI use policy is written and approved by academic council, quality and governing body, AI has moved on. Did we create specific policies for iPads, interactive whiteboards, the blackboard, overhead projectors? Are we already too late?
I start out with that. I actually have banned the word policy around artificial intelligence because it, as that question states, it's impossible to keep up with it. I think guidelines. A guideline suggests a dynamic, interpretive element, can identify what it means to you in practice and utilize it in a kind of energized way. It's not, policy would suggest, here are the rules, if you breach the policy, then rules. So, and I totally agree. I kind of, I'm very slow to use. So good practice principles, those kinds of things. And we've introduced good practice principles in UL. You know, I think there is, I think, and it'll be interesting to see what the HEA will come out with their AI policy framework towards the end of this year, and how that be interpreted by HEIs in Ireland, whether they rush to develop policy or whether they rush to develop guidelines of practice and supports around that. So I agree with the sentiment of the question. I'm very careful about policing this. This technology.
Yeah. I think the interactive whiteboard policies don't write on it with the marker. Punya Mishra has a great one as well about when all this AI literacy things are coming out, and he wrote this very witty one about pencil literacy. We need pencil literacy, and it's a great satire. I would encourage you to check that out. But I think we might just give all our speakers a round of applause, please, and thank them very much.